Pode ser o Grupo Corpo ou a Companhia de Dança do Pantanal. Museu de Arte Moderna de São Paulo ou Arte em Cores. Filarmônica de Minas Gerais ou Programa Vale Música. Restauração do Museu Nacional ou da Cripta da Basílica de Nazaré. Onde tem cultura, a Vale está. Dos projetos que todo mundo já conhece, até aqueles projetos que todo mundo precisa conhecer. A cultura brasileira tem o nosso apoio. É valorizando essa cultura que crescemos e evoluímos juntos. Instituto Cultural Vale. Ministério da Cultura e a Associação Casa Azul apresentam 21ª Flip, Festa Literária Internacional de Paraty. A Flip conta com benefício da Lei de Incentivo à Cultura, Lei Rouanet, PRONAC 231427, e possui acessibilidade para pessoas com deficiência física, visual e auditiva. Tem patrocínio Master, Instituto Cultural Vale. Patrocínio Ouro, Itaú, CCR e Caixa. Patrocínio Prata, O Globo, Mac Imóveis e Sebrae. Patrocínio Bronze, Globo Livros e Eletronuclear. Parceria institucional SESC, Prefeitura de Paraty, Embratur e Museu do Território. É uma concepção, Associação Casa Azul. Realização, Ministério da Cultura, Governo Federal, Brasil, União e Reconstrução. encontro da literatura com a cidade.
Boa tarde.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for attending another session, special session. We're starting now. This session is a land of smokes, discovery by our wars. The idea is to think about poets who develop new languages to give access to what is common and foreign with communication. You will see it's a very special, poetic session. It will help us think profoundly about the different paths of what it means to have sounds, languages, silences, and the body of a poet. It will be conducted and mediated by Patrícia Lino. She is a UCLA translator, and they are special mediator. Thank you very much, and let's have a wonderful session. Thank you. Thank you. Hello, good afternoon, everyone, one and all. It's an immense pleasure to be here on the 10th session, Land of Smoke and Discoveries. I have with me Ilya Kaminsky, Bruna Beber, and Jorge Augusto, whom I will very briefly introduce now. Ilya Kaminsky was born in Odessa in the Soviet Union in 1977, in the then Soviet Union. He exiled with his family in the United States in 1993, where he still lives. He wrote Dancing in Odessa and Deaf Republic, published this year by Companhia das Letras and translated by Maria Cecilia Brandi. His more recent work, which is Deaf Republic, was shortlisted for the National Book Awards, and it won the National Jewish Book Award and the LA Times Book Prize. In 2019, Deaf Republic was elected Book of the Year by the New York Times, and it became an editorial phenomenon. Bruna Beber was born in 1984 in Rio de Janeiro. She is a poet, a translator, visual artist, and a master in literary history and theory by the University of Campinas. She wrote many poetry books, such as A Fila Sem Fim dos Demônios Descontentes, Balés, Rapapés e Apupos, A Rua da Padaria, Ladainha, and more recently, Veludo Roco and Sal de Fruta, published this year by Círculo de Poemas. She also published an essay book called Uma Encarnação Encarnada em Mim, Cosmogonias Encruzilhadas em Stella do Patrocínio, and the child book, Zebruzinha. She translated Louis Glock, Anne Sexton, Shakespeare, Sylvia Plath, Lewis Carroll, Eileen Miles, Dr. Seuss, among many others. Jorge Augusto was born in 1982. He is a poet, a professor. He is from this neighborhood of Liberdade. He has a PhD in literature and culture by the University of Bahia, and he's also a professor at the State University of the Southeast of Bahia and the Federal Institute of Bahia. He organized the book Contemporaneidades Periféricas in 2018, and he is the editor of the Brazilian literature magazine Organismo. In 2023, he published his first poetry book called O Mapa da Casa. And he's also launching this year Modernismo Negro. It is a theory and a literary critic book looking into the work of Lima Barreto. So before we pass the floor to our guests, I would ask each one of the authors to read an excerpt of their books.
Thank you so much. First, it's truly an honor to be here with all of these wonderful poets and in this audience, and I'm so grateful both to the festival and to my publisher for making that happen. The poem I'll read is called We Live Happily During the War. We live happily during the war. And when they bombed other people's houses, we protested, but not enough. We opposed them, but not enough. I was in my bed. Around my bed, America was falling. Invisible house by invisible house by invisible house. I took a chair outside and watched the sun. In a 6 month of a disastrous rain, in the house of money, in a street of money, in a city of money, in a country of money, our great country of money. We forgive us, living happily during the war.
Jorge? Good evening, or good afternoon. Dismembered. Every day the bodies trundle down the stairway, breaking into pieces like glasses of water, going out and coming back from home to work, on days off, dominoes and cards, exhausting themselves with the fatal fall between one step and the next, trundling up and down, heads, legs and arms, floating in space. Pieces of crystal shattered like glass, their beautiful and lethal glow, opaque like acrylic. Learning to love the shards of all this glass, delving for its bleeding and fascinating splendor is the hardest task. Love crashed on the stairway of our Nossa Senhora das Graças alley, but the weaving of cement and mortar reshapes the fragments, the shards and the remnants of tiles, making mosaics, decorating verandas and alleyways. Good afternoon. Angular. What my dead ones don't know and will never hear of is that I'm still here and smiling in the lost scene in the past of their lives. Shadows and color, alive, smiling inside my life. In the morning, when the coffee spills out of my cup, I'm still a child and I hear the clackety-clack, clackety-clack, clackety-clack of my aunt's typewriter. My Nana went through the pantry via the kitchen door, rushed and alone and furious, attempting to rescue the roast meat. The bedroom door slams. I jump. A painting falls off the wall onto the desk. The refrigerator gushes. Waves. Heat and energy. They don't know, don't want, don't ask, but they creep along, and I crawl in electricity, a breath, an echo, a trace, a tick of words, of the permanent lingering of the words they said one day. I haven't finished my coffee yet. I don't miss them, though, as I know as soon as I get up from this table, I'll relive the world in height and grace, sitting on my uncle's shoulders. Thank you to the three of you. So before we begin this conversation, I would like to remind you that you might submit your questions in writing. Just send in the pieces of paper that are presented here in front of you in the chairs here. And the organizers asked me, and so that Ilya can read my lips, I will now switch this language from Portuguese into English.
Hello. Hello. So question number one for the three of you, Ilya, Bruna, and Jorge. Based on your most recent books, Ilya with Death Republic, Bruna with Veludo Rouco, and Jorge with O Mapa da Casa, it would be as accurate as it is coherent to say that for each one of you, the poem must make us, readers, see and hear what, as a rule, cannot be seen or heard in such a fast, vast, and sometimes very cruel world. Could you please comment, elaborate, both in political and technical terms, on this statement? And we can follow the order that we find in the program, so Ilya, Bruna, and Jorge, and then we will switch during the panel.
Thank you. Your questions are full of poetry.
Thank you.
Thank you. Number one is, I'm pretending I'm not really here because I didn't write this book in Portuguese. Maria Cecilia Brandi, who is sitting here, wrote it in Portuguese. I wrote it in English. So right there you have something invisible, which is a translator who is the real author in this language. Why I wanted to begin with it is because when I grew up in former USSR, I grew up as a deaf child with no hearing aids. So for me, my first language was not Yiddish, which my parents spoke at home, or Ukrainian, which was a language of Ukrainian Republic of USSR, or Russian, which was the official language of all of USSR, but lip reading. Language of lips. What does it mean to have a language of lip reading? It means that you and I stand on a street corner talking, and you're telling me about secrets of poetry. And there is a cat walking by, touching your foot, and their tail goes like this. Above you, on a balcony, somebody is putting laundry and dropping something, and it falls on a policeman, and policeman doesn't know what hit them. A person is trying to stop a cab, a taxi, and decides it's too expensive, shuts the door and walks. And all of that is a part of your sentence that I am reading as I am reading your lips. How do I bring it into poetry was a question for me. And that was the language of images. And in a way, my book is not really written in English, but in images. And the question I try to ask, what is it that invisible that you're saying that can become visible through images? And that was silence. Yes, it's called Death Republic. Yes, it's about a country at war. Yes, it's about how people don't just die at war, but survive at war, try to have children at war, despite war. But they do it through the language of lovers the language of protest, the language of trying to communicate despite all the vast distances between us. How do I show that silence with images? After all, we speak against silence, but it is silence that moves us to speak. Silence can also be a language of two lovers. When words are not enough, or words have said everything there is to be said, and we just looking at each other in silence as bombs fall. Or silence can be a horrible thing when people are silenced by the state. Or there can be metaphysical silence, silence of God. We speak to try to find what God is, but the silence of God is God. So I try to find many different situations in a story or poetry to show that silence through words.
Thank you so much. Bruna ou Jorge?
É o Jorge.
Either
Sou
way.
eu? Então,
So, first, good afternoon. Thank you. I would like to thank Fernanda Bastos and Milena Brito for having invited me. I'm so happy to be here. And I guess the challenge of those who write black literature, periphery literature, and around the world, it is to bring or give voice to something that is obvious. It is not to allow what we are seeing every day to become natural. And it is difficult to do this, very, very difficult to do this. It is difficult for you to leave a city such as the one that I live in, which is Salvador, the blackest city in the world outside Africa. And it is a city where more black people die in Brazil or are killed. So how can we aesthetically, the peripheral literature is an art. How can we elaborate this, aesthetically speaking, to communicate to people who are seeing that on a daily basis, that we cannot continue to make that normal in this sense? To find this halfway between the aesthetics and the speech is the challenge of contemporary literature, I guess, for all of us here. And I guess we are trying to do this, and at least I try to do this, in this map, which is a map of many paths. But this is what we need to do. It is to give voice to what is seen but not heard in this game in which we develop a picture. It's shadows and light. It's not that you're not seeing it. It's because you have seen it so many times that it becomes normal to you, natural to you, almost ordinary. So I guess the challenge for this black literature, among many others, is to unnaturalize this precarious daily lives of black lives in Brazil. And this is only possible after a humane production of the black literature. And this is what we're trying to do. And here in the Mapa de Casa and also in the critique and everything. Yeah, it's difficult to know what will bring an image to poem, and it's difficult sometimes to withdraw some things from the invisible, from the mysterious. And speaking specifically about Veludo Roku, my book, I tried to bring an echo chamber of different voices that were absolutely part of what I am, and became me, not only as a poet, but in the matter of my poetry, progressively speaking. So I wanted to bring a sort of a chorus of these different voices that made me who I am, which educated my ear, my eyes, my body, gave me a rhythm, a pace. So, veludo rouco, in a free translation, would be hoarse velvet, will be a way of, or raspy velvet, would be a way of allowing me to be who I am in the world. But it's not something just to pay tribute. It's not just an altar. I guess there still is, because the book still exists. It didn't exist then, it exists now. This will of trying to bring a history to these anonymous voices, voices from my heart, from my mind. And it is a type of sorority that I wanted to present to the world.
All that you have said relates to my second question. Wonderful. Question number 2. The three of you share an interest in the city as concept and setting. Ilya, in your book, Odessa is the setting for your theatrical and collective poems. Bruna, in Veludo Rouco, the history of several areas of São Paulo is retold through very particular and interesting figures of Brazilian culture. Jorge, everything in O Mapa da Casa revolves around the history, erasure, or colonial structuring of periferia. What exactly does making poems about the city involve? How do you think about the city based on the identity of those who write? Is reconstructing the history of those who live in the city a form of political resistance, struggle? And we can begin with Bruna.
Before the city, we have the street. A street is a main character for my poetry, of all my books, of all the my work, because I was raised in the suburbs of Rio de Janeiro, in the outskirts. I was raised, playing out in the streets, playing games, and many things that I've learned have to do, playing with my kids, my friends on the plays and on the different games we played. So I was always surrounded by many children. And I used to play, outdoors, indoors, but the street was always there calling me back.
So I developed my voice, my body, the way I related with people, and consequently the way I write in the streets. So little by little, as I grew up, I welcomed the city. Because first you welcome the street you were born at, and then little by little you welcome in the neighboring streets, the cities, the countries, the continents, and the world looks closer. So it's very good to start little by little with one street. As I discovered the streets, the cities, and since I lived in a location that was distant from everything, commuting was part of my life. So in order to be near what I wanted to be, music, poetry, culture, cinema, whatever, culture itself, I had to commute. Commute for hours in the city. Even walking. I would walk to downtown Rio. I would walk to the different neighborhoods in Rio, the southern areas of Rio. So I also educated myself as a walker in the city. And this gave me the perspective of a chronicler, giving me images that were always going by the window, because I looked at these images from my window seat. I mean, from the window, from the train, the buses, images in movement, high-speed moving images that I saw through the windows while I commuted by train. So the city, of course, is always present in my poetry because it is part of my life, and it sort of became inherent part of my life. And I also love to learn about other cities, leave the context of the periphery in Rio de Janeiro, and understand global dynamics, different landscapes. I live in the state of São Paulo, in the city of São Paulo, for 16 years now, and I still feel that the city is little by little being part of myself. I am learning how to live in the city, relating. I'm always a walker, an intentional walker. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Jorge. Então,
So, I grew up during the 80s, 90s, when Salvador had outdoors of the narrative of the city. It's a wonderful city, the beautiful city. Go visit Salvador. That was, everywhere. On TV, outdoors, everybody. And I thought that was weird. Yes, of course, the city is welcoming and beautiful, but it's hostile. Us, black and poor people, hostile, totally hostile. So I grew amongst these two cities, but living only in one, in the outskirts, in the periphery. So I talk about this location, this street, downtown, because the irony of the book is that the home map is the street, because the street is where black Brazilians socialize. There is a book by Joan Reis, a great book, Slave Rebellion. And all of his books are great, are fantastic. You should read them. So he tells us how Ismael's rebellion took place with Muslim black slaves teaching other black slaves read and write in the corners of the streets, and then together with all of these Negroes, slaves that were taught to read and write, they rebelled. So they organized a rebellion. And Igor, as the narrator in this book, houses are small, are inhabited by multiple peoples. They're very precarious places of affectivity. Lima Barreto talks about this small house with 20 people living in one room, as in prison. As Osmond Dupinho says, that space in the periphery reproducing the intimacy of prison. And this is what I explain in my poem called Slaughtered, because I want to talk about the spatial incarceration in periphery. In peripheries, and in the cities in the periphery, you don't have a square, you don't have recreation, you don't have bars, cinemas, bookstores. So this space creates subjective centers that are very difficult to understand. And this has to do with your subjective unfolding, that has to do with this metaphor, with the fact that, and in books like Mandingo's El Salvador, the Tomb City, Milton Borges, El Salvador, the Black City, it is a recurring topic in literature that is always recurrent and going back to this territory. So the idea is not to make the city romantic, and without making periphery as a romantic place of creativity. Because even as precarious as the periphery is, we do have a genre, hip-hop, rap. That is literature from the periphery. We have artistic manifestations that are very rich, but the continuity of the precariousness cannot be romanticized. That type of art is not a justification for precariousness. On the contrary, it should give us the foundation to fight against precariousness, so that these so-called aesthetic preconditions can give us the possibilities to focus our country towards a different future. As Milton Santos said, the solution for Brazil, and this was in the 70s, Milton Santos, the solution for Brazil has to do with listening to the poor people's experience and the aesthetics of the peripheral black production, artistic expressions outside of the proposal imagined by this translation. It is not healthy to think about the fact that we have peripheral black literature as resistance, fight only. It is part of literature. But from an aesthetic perspective, we have to look at these works of art and understand that they are giving us options for the failure of modernity and the failure of our nation project. I think that's the way out.
Once again, a beautiful question. For answers.
Thank you.
I was wondering what can I add to what was already said. And in some ways, it's a political question. City is a polis. That's where the word politics comes from. But on the other side, it's a metaphysical question, because that's where poet comes from. How do the two coexist? One can say, to deny the question, that a poet is not born in a city or a country, but in childhood. And what do we mean by that? We mean that in childhood, we name things the way the poet names things. As we say, Adamic task of a poet, to give them their names. But it is kind of an old idea of Adamic task of a poet, and it might be nice to reinvent it a little bit. Maybe we don't go around naming things, but go around saying, because things hurt us in childhood. Or we go around saying, because things are mysterious in childhood. And as we grow older, we try to take that space into language, to try to carry that strangeness into language. Now, in my personal story, I was born in USSR, a country that no longer exists, in the city of Odessa, that when my grandmother was born, the city was 60% Jewish. In 1918, I'm Jewish. When my parents were born in 1937 and 39, the city was about 40% Jewish. When I was born in 1977, the city was 20% Jewish. Now it is less than 1%. So right there you got history in the numbers. How do you carry that into language? You can still recreate that city in language to give that place second life in words. Now, when you happen to be a refugee or an immigrant going from one place to another, and if you happen to write in a language of images, literally, what do you do? And in my case, I was struck by some of the images that are similar in a place like Ukraine, which is at war since 2014, for almost 10 years, invaded by the empire. And United States, where I live in San Diego, California, 9 miles from the border. And we all see on TV what is happening on the American border. The children are being put in cages. And those images are strikingly similar. The images of violence in the country at war for 10 years, and the images of violence in the world's larger empire. So in some ways, a refugee or an immigrant is a person who lives one foot in one place and another foot in another place. The world of childhood and the world of the present. And the question I was trying to ask is, how can I tell a story in poems that is true to both of those places, where I wouldn't be thinking, oh, I'm just living in my childhood Russian Empire or Soviet Union, which doesn't exist, or not saying I'm abandoning it all and I'm just American now. Because that would be fake. How can I find the truth in both? And I realized that the book had to be, first of all, find a genre. And the genre was one of fairy tale or fable. Why fairy tale, why fable, why a story in verse? Because a fairy tale is a genre that is true in childhood and for adults. It is a genre that doesn't believe in borders between nations. Here in Brazil, you might still be reading Hans Christian Andersen or Brothers Grimm. In Ukraine, they're still reading 100 Years of Solitude by Garcia Marquez. So a fairy tale travels across borders, which is why the book decided to take that genre to reflect those specific places.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. And I guess we have time for a last question. It is also obvious that the three of you are interested in other forms of creation or expression. Ilya, your book is impossible to define in terms of genre. Poetry, theater, poetry and theater. You also include various drawings of sign language in Deaf Republic. Bruna, it is impossible to read you and not immediately think of the performative use of the voice or Brazilian music, canção brasileira. Jorge, your book contains drawings, and we should not read your poems without the drawings. Perhaps the drawings are the poems themselves, or your poems are drawings as well. Can the three of you comment on this interdisciplinary use of language? Also, would you be interested in testing other tools, techniques, or expressions in the future? And we can begin with Jorge.
Well, first of all, I would like to talk about the drawings in my book, dedicated to Jefferson Bispo, my friend, the only living person quoted in the book. Everybody else cited in my book has passed away in police situations or in encounters with the police. And when I finished my book, I called Jefferson and I said, Jefferson, you need to make these drawings because it has to be somebody that lived there, that knows that street. And he was very happy. It was difficult for him. I mean, it's not easy to remember those things in the past, let alone talk about those things. And then what we did was make a drawing, and the circle of poems and Phosphor, the publishing house, received his drawings very well. It was there was a timeline in the book. I mean, you go downstairs, and then you see this in the book. You go up the stairs and you go outside. And then when we launched the book, and I'll tell you about this because this has to do with my comment, when we decided when we would launch the book, Jefferson's son was killed with 80 shots in the street, Libertades Street, 80 shots. And I say this because the things that I talk about, I mean, because my book, my home's map, is not a memoir. It's not a memoir of what I lived in my street. No, not at all. When we talk about black literature, we have to think about the idea of your testimonial. And with Cesar, he's sitting there, we talked about this. This is totally different from traditional literature because we are witness of the witness of something that is still going on. And that is coloniality. Coloniality is existent today, and it is still present today. Me as a writer, maybe, I mean, we writers maybe know less about our work, but your testimony is the testimony of what is or still a fact. It's not about the past. So these drawings are the second testimonial in my book. You have first my testimonial and then Jefferson's testimonial with his drawings. So two literary works in the same corpus with an intersemiotic connection. And I also do this with other artistic activities. And I also published the book, the magazine, and the publishing house, now for 10 years now, about the key topics in my book, which is intercultural dialogue with Brazilian society. We many times heard people saying, oh yes, black literature is a different thing, it's a different thing, it's a division, it's another group. That's really stupid. Black literature is the place we choose to occupy, to claim about what we want to claim about. It is the space for dialogue, to engage in a dialogue. It is purposely the place for dialogue. Any book in black literature. In my book, I choose to talk from this territory. And this is exactly the same thing that I do with my editing, and it's exactly the same thing that I do with my job, my intellectual job. So there is a key or a core that structures everything that I do, which is to talk from a place in my territory. It's not that I will talk about territory or that I will talk about regionalism. No, it's the place I occupy as a writer, engaging in a dialogue with different layers in Brazilian society, in Brazilian society's fabric, living this fabric from the different layers and the different statements from the different territories. Because if we don't occupy this space, we will never reach the universality of, that is why Brazilian and Western literature is understood in a timeline as an evolution. But my proposal in everything I do and in my book is to think about the territory from the territory, because ever since Lima Barreto, territory is where multiple layers of Brazilian society lie, rather. Bruna, well, I just remembered you talked about music, your relationship with music, and brother of my wife. So it's a very complicated family line, and this mess, I don't know who I am anymore. And then this child is my granddad, and that's how the song goes on and on. It's a popular child's song that my mom taught me when I was 6. Isn't it great? I remember that all of a sudden. So this is one of the first things I heard, and my mom sang this song. Yeah, you're reading. You're laughing, I'm laughing, you're laughing at me. And my mom made me learn by heart this song. In the car, traveling with my mom and dad, I learned about rhyme. These were the first teachings. Legends, wit, a lot of stuff that I learned with this song, a lot of stuff about Brazil. So music entered my life like this, in this sung story. And then at school, in poetry contests, I always mention the fact that in my school, poetry was a big thing. The discovery of poems and poetic word as a mode of expression. So when I was 7, I wanted to write poetry. That was because my school really was fantastic in that sense. So I learned how to write, listening and singing what people talked about and told me and what people were talking about around me. So I can say that during my childhood, there was a lot of harmony and melody. The place I was raised in Rio de Janeiro, São João de Meriti, and the city Duque de Caxias, it was a city inhabited by northern inhabitants of Brazil that migrated to Rio de Janeiro. So we had a lot of fairy tales and stories and legends. So I grew up listening to what community members had to share, understanding what they said and how I could translate this into my words. So in this periphery, where people are always telling stories and talking and neighbors taking care of one another's children, and the collective nature of these cities. So I absorbed all of these stories, all of these songs, and that is how I really wanted to express myself through writing, through music. And my dream has always been to be a composer. And I ended up being a composer, so a poet, a composer. So good for me, I guess.
They've given you that it makes me wonder if the question is much broader, that you're asking why combine different things in a poem. But the poem itself is a combination of different things.
Exactly.
It's not quite a sound you hear on the radio. It's not quite a story you remember your parent telling you. It's kind of both, or neither. So how does that work? Lorca, great poet of Spanish language, tells us that poet is a professor of 5 senses. Not a professor of creative writing at the university, but 5 senses. So already a hybrid of those senses. And you're really asking why a hybrid genre, right? But we can go a little further and ask, why do we even remember a poet? What is a great poet? And to my mind, the great poet is not somebody who can yell in a microphone at a stadium to thousands of people. Any fool with a microphone and a PR agent can do that. A poet is somebody who is a very private person, who can speak privately enough, strangely enough, beautifully enough, memorably enough to many people at the same time. That is already a kind of hybrid. But not to avoid your question, but to answer it more directly, why, in my case, a puppet theater? Why puppets? My grandfather in 1937 was called the enemy of the people and shot by Stalin's regime. And grandmother was sentenced to Siberia for over a decade. She came back with stories. In one of those stories, she states that prisoners who had to go to work in the camp every day for a decade, and a new year tried to make a celebration. So out of bread, they made little puppets. And the bed was a stage, and they told those stories. And when somebody died, on their bed, they put their puppet. So that kind of idea of theater being a part of a story, being a part of a song, was very much in a memory already. But then comes the larger question of what is a hybrid genre? Why not just write novels? Why not just write sonnets? And I have nothing against sonnets or novels. I love reading them. I think we write hybrid genre not to be cool or not to be super innovative and change everything, but because the reality that we know, a crisis of that reality, cannot be expressed by a conventional form. And so we have to recreate form in order to most honestly express the reality that we see.
Thank you so much, Ilya. And we still have time to read one more poem from each one of you. And then I will choose maybe 2 questions from the public. E quero relembrar-lhes, por favor, se quiserem perguntar.
I want to remind you all, if you want to ask our guests any question, please remember that you have a piece of paper and call our receptionists that can read your questions out loud.
I actually don't know if we have translation into Portuguese
On screen, but I think
I got it.
we will read the poem from page 44. Maybe we can begin with Bruna or Jorge while we wait for this translation of Ilya's poem.
Ou dois? Dolores
Duran in her 100th anniversary. If time is a brick and sugar, is honey to grind my teeth. If time is there, it is the sawdust that falls when I open the window to see whatever I see through the window. With time and with my grinding teeth, I can have the life I can applaud and watch. And like this, I open up a window of 8 decades. To the left, Dolores Duran is a teenager, and she lives in Centenario, in the neighborhood of Duque de Caxias. To the right, I am a child in the neighborhood Centenario in Duque de Caxias. I open up the window, and in the sawdust of days, we cross one another one afternoon at 3:30 p.m. just around the corner of the bakery. After lunch, I extend our sugarcane, sugar, and we cross the railroads. Dolores raises me, and we run together. We never felt cold in our neighborhood, but Dolores lends me her coat made of bricks and sugar, and we go out together to play in the highway called Dr. Manuel Reyes. I can shape, wrap. I give time back with all of my pains and graces. I lived in the voice of my neighborhood. That obsession about writing, singing, and living belongs to her.
Vamos lá, gente. Eu vou ler.
Now I will read Landscapes of Home. Colonial architecture of the homes without a balcony, very small living rooms, one on top of the next, mountains of cascading houses crammed together, continued the drama of exiled dead boys, naked girls, trampled bodies full of holes like the streets, avenues and alleys. The stairs over the open sewer were grandstand seats on Sunday. Bingo was keeping tabs on other people's lives, betting beers on the results of the game. On the map of houses, there was no sacred space. The front room linking bedroom to kitchen, the bathroom was the laundry room. Half-height wall, open tile roof, makeshift clothesline. Inside this small, half-finished home, a vast world is squeezed in with jam-packed dreams in storage jars, wanting to go beyond brick and mortar.
And I meant to say that if we can't have the translation on the screen, I can read the version in
perfect.
Portuguese.
Yeah,
Yes,
thank you.
of course. You go first, and then I will read the translation.
This little love poem, since I have been talking too much about war, here's some love. Before the war, we made a child. Before the war, we made a child. I kissed the woman whose freckles are us, the neighbors. She had a mole on her shoulder, which she displayed like a medal for bravery. Her trembling lips might come to bed. Her hair, were fallen in the middle of the conversation, might come to bed. I walked in my barber shop of thoughts. Yes, I weaved her off to bed on the chair of my hairy arms. But parted lips might bite my parted lips land under the cool sheets. So now, the things we did.
Thank you so much again and again and again. I have a few questions from the public, and I will begin by a question from Paula, and it's for the three of you. So Paula, I will translate her question. The act of translating opens a third language, creates a third language that it is not the translated language, neither the original language. How much of silence fits in a translation? Who wants to go first?
Translation is like believing in God. It is impossible, but you do it.
Respondido.
You nailed it.
In our specific case, when you take a book where Muniz Saldanha talks about intercultural translation, that we Brazilians necessarily need to think about two semiotic systems, the black and the white semiotic system. We're talking about a culture that is constantly translating itself. That is one of the elements and one of the devices that black literature uses, translate culturally what black culture is for the whole of Brazil that neglected during hundreds and hundreds of years, that cultural production, that black Portuguese that is part of the material structure and fabric of our nation, with hundreds of indigenous peoples' languages, hundreds of black people's languages that came to Brazil through the Middle Passage with the different genres, the literary genres, the worlds that these languages represent were never translated in the general makeup of the Brazilian literary field. Undoubtedly never. Not even for a festive or allegoric understanding of Brazilian culture. So today we do that, exactly that. That is, be the narrators of this black world, which is what? Black Brazilian culture, what is not restricted to football or carnival. From an epistemological perspective, football exists as part of the black heritage and the coloniality we are living now, which is the structuring strength behind the violence we live in, social relations in the country, can only be overcome when these two semiotic systems will enter into a non-hierarchical dialogue. I think that one of the things that black literature does, and that literature from the peripheries does is to translate, expand, expose, circulate our literature. It is an inglorious task, as Ilya mentioned, in the sense that most population in the Brazilian elite does not want to listen. So it's a translation for no one. But we need to do this translation, and it is done by us that show the black culture to a Brazil that denies it, that has another dimension in translation made by Brazilian black culture. May I give you an example? Just as an answer. First, Veludo Rocco's first poem, The Sitting Room, is an attempt to translate and transcribe and transcreate a sentence, a prayer, something that goes on and on and on, that I heard in a church at Vilar das Teles town here in the state of Rio de Janeiro, Santa Rita de Lucia Church, not recognized, a saint not recognized by the Catholic Church, but is recognized for everything that's important. It's a very syncretic church within Umbanda, Spiritism, Catholicism, and I was raised, and I always prayed in this church. I opened Veludo Rocco with this liturgy. And it took a long time. It took me a long time to really sum up and make a summary of all of these teachings and oral traditions of the horses of Santa Rita. It is called Lucia. Heavenly Father, nobody knows who will sweep our doorsteps. If the wind that blows, or a lullaby wind. That is why we sing to Saint Rita, and hence we pray to Saint Rita, for in the turn of an eye, goodness devours, but look out, Saint Rita, your visitors are here, approaching on horseback in a cavalcade. Not the white horse, who's deluded. The black one indeed can roam.
Esqueci de pedir licença.
I forgot to ask for permission. I ask for your permission now. And one question from the audience, and then George, for you a question, George Augusto, from somebody that is asking the following thing. George, can you talk a little bit about how black Lima Barretta's modern movements encounter your experience and poetry in your book, My Home's Map? Well, it's directly connected, because what I research, what I defend with black modernism in a nutshell, I would say, it is of course something that I've done for many years now, but like this. Lima Barreto narrates, he thinks about this modernity, I would say, quoting Roberto Schwartz, in the periphery of modernity, in the suburbs of Rio de Janeiro, thinking about what modernity is from this location. What is modernity? Considered modernity something that is intrinsic to a specific territory, leaving aside the universal nature of modern experience that ethnocentrism brought to Brazil through positivism that Lima Barreto criticized. That was impossible. It is impossible, as was the case, and it is impossible today, and it was impossible in past modern movements, as Roberto Schwartz showed with the different texts in the different times of this progression. But Lima Barreto mentioned this in 1909. Lima mentioned this in 1911. He talked about this directly. So what I do in my book is to narrate the contemporary aspect of peripheral contemporary realities, how a criticism of Brazilian literature can be itself criticism, peripheral, because work from periphery has always existed, but what has never been from the periphery is the review, the criticism. So this is the new thing. How can a review, a criticism, be peripheral? And this is what I do in my book, because I think about this contemporary approach from a peripheral territory. And this is connected to what I identified in my proposal and in my interpretation of Lima Barreto. When books, I am a faculty member of Brazilian contemporary literature, and I'm fed up of the fact that all books that talk about contemporary literature use as corpus texts of poets from the southeastern part of Brazil, almost exclusively white. So this contemporary landscape is almost postmodern. It's totally outdated, or it's the modernism from the city of São Paulo from 1920. What about the rest of Brazil? What about black literature? What about literature in the periphery in this contemporary summary? Because literature in the peripheries and black literature are considered contemporary because of their synchronicity. But that's not the thing. They are contemporary, but they were not considered contemporary in their contribution towards the aesthetics and epistemology. And conversely, what I defend in peripheral contemporaneous literature, we cannot talk about black contemporary literature if we don't radically consider black and indigenous literature, because what is contemporary is exactly outside as was agreed upon to be Brazilian literature, and not in the continuity or disrupture, in the continuity or disrupture of the evolution line of Brazilian literature, in positivism, classic positivism, or in the concrete poetry theory that rupture always goes back to the great moments, and great moments always are in an evolutionary dialogue. That is why territory is the cornerstone of my work, because only territory and the multiple layers that exist and coexist, even the multiple nature of time.
Thank you. It's unfortunately we don't have more time. We have to go, but I will invite all of you to go with them so they can sign your books. It's really close to this place, and I want to thank all the three of you again. It was a pleasure to be with you all here. Muito obrigada.
Thank you very much.
Depois também para a mesa 11.
And I invite you to come to the 11th session, starting at 5 p.m. Thank you very much.